Hello again. This is the class that would normally be held this coming Tuesday morning. And it's the last such class that we'll have. We'll have one class after this one that'll be devoted to review. So this is the last lecture class per se, and it's got something of review in it as well. The very last class would have been next Thursday, but I'm going to give that over to giving you time to prepare for the final, and I'll have the final ready for you to go either Thursday or Friday of next week, which will give you the weekend to prepare for it. You'll have the questions, so you'll be preparing your answers. We left off last time with the execution of the king. That happened very quickly in 1640. He was on trial on the 17th of January. He was convicted on the 20th, sentenced to death on the 27th of January. The sentence to take place 3 days later. His children came to see him for the last time on January 29, and on January 30, it was done as I described last time. There is a great painting by an artist whose name I cannot remember that shows Oliver Cromwell somewhat sadly looking at Charles I as he lies in his coffin. It's a great painting, particularly if you've seen any of those versions of the trial and execution on YouTube. The best book about the trial and execution also involves a coffin. It's called A Coffin for King Charles, and it is by the British historian Cynthia Wedgwood. It's a great book to read. If you were standing there in 1649 when the axe came down, you might have reflected, or some of the unbelievable events of the last two lifetimes might have passed through your mind. You remember way back in the 1530s when Henry VIII broke with the Church of Rome, established the Church of England with himself as the head of the Church of England, and executed his close friend, really his only friend, his close friend, the great Christian humanist Thomas More, who refused to sign an oath of loyalty to the king as the head of the church. At about that same time, mid-1530s, Galileo was on trial for his life in Rome. He stood before the Inquisition in Rome, and under the threat of torture, finally consented to retract what he had said about Copernicus having been right in his new structure of the universe. He retracted it, and instead of being sentenced to burn or being tortured into a further confession, he was sentenced to life in prison under house arrest. That didn't have any real impact on scientific work in England, where scientists are working towards a verdict on Copernicus. Was he right or was he wrong? Remember, the Pope doesn't have any authority in England any longer, since Henry VIII broke with the church, and neither Henry nor Elizabeth had any problems with scientific research. Elizabeth came to the throne in 1655. She continued her father's work to establish the Church of England. She saved the country from conquest and invasion by defeating the Spanish Armada. In the 1670s, I believe, she was forced, she believed, to have her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, arrested for treason and executed. Mary turns out to be not only Queen Elizabeth's cousin, but also the mother of the man who is going to succeed Elizabeth when she died childless without a husband in 1603. Is the wind going to be too loud? Huh?
A little loud.
All right. So, in 1603, the executed Queen of Scotland's. Now, I know this gets confusing with the kings and queens. I know you're saying, what do we need all these kings and queens for? They're the people who are making this happen. They're the people who count. And if you know their names, and at least the sequence, not the dates necessarily, but the sequence of their rules, it will be a lot easier for you to understand, I believe. When James became King of England, he had already been King of Scotland. He gave up being King of Scotland in order to become being King of England, James I. And we know James I for three things. We know that he went to war against tobacco, big tobacco. He hated tobacco. He thought it was devilish. He was all in favor of the theory of divine right of kings. He believed that whoever is king at any given time, at any given place, is king because God wants him or her to be ruler, king or queen, and that ruler answers to no human agency in his lifetime, but will certainly answer to God in the end, as we all will. But as Charles the First, soon to be executed, would say, kings and subjects are clean, different things. And of course, he got that from his father. When Charles became king in 1625, this is the king whose execution we talked about. When Charles became king in 1625, he walked into a hornet's nest of opposition in the Parliament. Members of the lower house, the House of Commons, were against him because they believed he had a tendency to rule tyrannically, that is, without any limit. The Puritans hated him because he was the head of the Church of England, and he governed the Church of England through bishops, which he appointed. And the Puritans thought that was too much carryover, hangover Catholicism, and it had to go. And so they're fiercely opposed to him, as is the lower House of Representatives. And increasingly, it becomes two different ways of saying the same thing. Puritans, members of the House of Commons, become more and more and more the same thing, the same people involved. Well, the result of this hornet's nest that the king walks into in 1625, we know, is civil war, the king's defeat, trial, execution, so forth, that we've covered already. After the king's death, Parliament, now completely Puritan, decided to do away with the monarchy altogether. So there's not going to be a monarch, king or queen, in England for the next 11 years, from 1649 to 1660. England is governed instead by a Puritan military dictatorship, and it took only 11 years for everybody just about to agree that 11 years of Puritan rule was more than enough, a whole lot more than enough, and it was almost by universal consent or demand that Parliament restore the monarchy by inviting the late king's son, another Charles, to return to his home and take up the rule of England in the Stuart family name. King Charles II, as he's known, was glad to accept the invitation, and he made a very wise decision in the earliest days of his monarchy that he was not going to cross Parliament in any meaningful way ever, under any circumstances. And I think he realized that Parliament, not wanting any repeat of the previous decade, on its part either, was not going to push him too hard in any direction. He did insist on one thing, though. Any members of Parliament who had signed his father's death warrant and who were no longer living, they were going to be exhumed and their skeletons would be hanged in public as symbolic punishment for killing a king, his father. He had one advantage, the king did, in the years of his reign, and that was that he was privately funded. He had made a secret arrangement with the King of France, whereby in return for a nice income, Charles would keep England out of the way of France's attempt to dominate Europe. This was called the Secret Treaty of Dover, and it let Charles give Parliament a wide berth, let him steer clear of any potential problem with the Parliament. In 1679, Parliament passed the Habeas Corpus Act, and Charles had no objection to it, had no intention of blocking that in any way. He died in 1685, as he had hoped. He died a natural death, and his place was taken by his brother, who had been Duke of York and now becomes King James II, King James II of England. That was in 1685. Within 2 years, 1687, James had alienated everybody in England. The Church of England, the Puritans, the Parliament, and what little there was of a educated, knowing public, as in public opinion, very limited. But the whole landscape, the whole spectrum, I mean to say, had turned against the king by 1687. But Parliament hesitated. No one wants to go to war again. No one wants a civil war. No one wants a king executed again. That was once was enough. And so Parliament holds back a little bit for a year until 1688, when they invite James to leave the country. James had no support, and so he made no attempt to resist. There was no war, there wasn't a shot fired, there was no bloodshed, hence the name the Glorious Revolution, 1688. James is gone, a new sovereign has yet to be found. But the big news, even bigger than that, came from the previous year, 1687, when Isaac Newton wrapped up the scientific revolution with conclusive scientific proof that Copernicus had been right all along, and that furthermore, we're dealing with a new theory of motion, which came chiefly from Galileo. So we have indeed a sun-centered universe and a new theory of motion, which I'll get to in a moment at the risk of, I hope I don't confuse you with that. But that broke in 1687 with the publication of Newton's book, The Principles. Now, Newton wrote in Latin, and there were very few people with enough scientific interest or knowledge to read it if it had been in English. The two people that did reacted in kind of the same way, sensing that nothing was ever going to be the same again as far as our understanding of what's out there. Alexander Pope, who I'm sure did not read a word of Newton, nevertheless understood the direction that it was going, and wrote of Newton the two-line poem I think I quoted to you earlier: nature and nature's laws lay hidden in night. That is to say, we knew nothing about the laws of nature. God took care of that. God said, let there be Newton. Then all was light. It was as if the lights came on and we understood finally the way nature is structured and operates. A reader who most certainly did read Newton with full understanding was a very eminent MD, a physician, medical doctor, named John Locke, L-O-C-K-E, John Locke. Locke read Newton's principles and wrote a very learned review expressing complete understanding and approval of what Newton had told us about the new universe. That review became the basis of a friendship between Locke and Newton that was more than a friendship. It was also a partnership as far as the propagation or the spreading of newness, new ideas, and in Locke's case, new ideas about government. And they both understood the other, and they both approved equally what the other was doing. I wanted to say also that I left this out. I wanted to say also that when James left the country in '88, Newton was 87, James left the country in '88, he left behind only 3 legacies. He left behind a daughter, Mary, whom we'll see in a moment. He left behind his name on the first English settlement in Virginia, Jamestown, and he left behind his name on a big and important state in the American colonial North. James had been the Duke of York, and New York State and New York City are named with him in mind. But other than that, from this point on, James is forgotten, and the throne remains vacant for 3 years. Parliament took until 1691 to decide on a successor to the deposed king and to prepare documents that whoever becomes king is going to have to sign and promise to abide by, or lose the monarchy, have Parliament strip him of the, or her, of the monument. And these documents are very important. One was called the Bill of Rights. The other was called the Act of Religious Toleration. And they are conditions under which the new sovereign will assume the throne, conditioned to observe and obey and respect the Bill of Rights and the Act of Toleration. And on that basis, the married couple we know as William and Mary assumed the throne of England. Mary was the closest blood relative to the deposed king. William was her Dutch husband. And they came across the Channel in 1691 to take up the throne of England as King William and Queen Mary. By that time, Locke had prepared his own ideas about the future and the Bill of Rights. And in a lot of ways, what Locke was talking about was very similar, you wouldn't think so, but very similar to what Isaac Newton had been writing about in the world of science and physics and math. Very similar to what John Locke was writing about in government and civil society. In 1690, Locke wrote a book that ought to be considered one of the founding books of, certainly is considered one of the founding books of English history and of American history as well. And Locke's book, so important in his own way as Newton's book, was called 2 Essays on Civil Government. Locke used a different word, treatises, but essay is a lot easier word. 2 Essays on Civil Government. A lot of similarities to what Newton was saying, and I'll try to explain this. If this just makes it confusing, I almost said you raise your hand, but that won't do any good. If you find this confusing, send me an email, and we'll try to straighten it out. Newton believed that The natural condition of things in the universe is perfect motion. Perfect in the sense on a straight line to forever. Obviously, something restricts that. Obviously, there's some glue, so to speak, to prevent the universe from disintegrating into 72 trillion pieces. Locke believed that in terms of mankind, we are not born with original sin and likely to end up in hell because of it, because of Adam's sin, sacrifice of Christ notwithstanding. Instead, Locke believed, we are born in perfect freedom, not perfect motion, but in perfect freedom. Now, what is perfect freedom? Locke believed that perfect freedom was probably a God-given right to threefold God-given right to life, to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sounds great, is great, but again, what's to keep a society in which everybody has perfect, total, 100% freedom to do anything he wants, every time he wants, wherever, whenever he wants or she wants? Well, it's not gravity, it's government. Government prevents anarchy. Government prevents the loss of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Why? Because, old saying, it's a jungle out there, and no man is safe in his basic rights without government there to protect his basic rights. So just as gravity is the glue for what we call the solar system, government for Locke is what prevents anarchy and wild, total, lawless freedom. The only reason, Locke believed, for having a government, only reason for having a government, is that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness need a shield behind which to flourish. And that's what government is, a shield for the basic rights. The governed will consent to such a government as long as it watches over and protects life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How do you and I do that? Well, we can't be eternally vigilant and take part in every vote, but we elect representatives. Locke called this arrangement the social contract, and it's the equivalent of gravity. It's what holds the thing together. If the government violates the three basic freedoms, your representative needs to be on top of that, not a part of that, and needs to convey that bad news to you. And if the news is verified, if it's not just baseless, if there's reason to think that the government is going beyond that limitation of protecting the three liberties, then we as a people, Locke said, have a right, and more than a right, we have the duty to bring that government down. That the only government with any moral or legal basis exists by the consent of the governed. That was powerful stuff. We take it for granted. Now, we have taken it for granted since these events in English history have unfolded, and since John Locke has written and justified those events as they happened in England to us. Locke's theory, like Newton's science, were tough enough, correct enough, stood the test of time, were able to cross 3,000 miles of salt water and flourish in America without missing a beat. durable, transportable, perfect fit for the New England, perfect fit for England in the New World as well. We accepted Locke, almost said lock, stock, and barrel. We accepted Locke, his ideas without question. We still do. But the shape of American government is not going to be the shape of English government. The concept, the underlying concept is identical, but the shape of our government is obviously not the shape of the government in English, or in England, or at least it ceased to be after 1776, the American Revolution. In the American version of Locke's government by the consent of the governed, in the English version, there's going to be a king, a limited king, a king whose power is limited. In the American version, there's going to be no king, and government is still going to be limited, of course. In the English version, there will be a titled, privileged nobility, limited but privileged, titled nobility, aristocratic class. In America, there will be no titled, privileged aristocracy, limited or not. There'll be none with any constitutional footing. In England, there will continue to be religious tests for a while. That is, tests meant to weed out Catholics from voting or serving in any political position. In England, the Church of England will continue as an established church with religious toleration outside the Church of England across the board, except as far as Catholics are concerned. In America, there will be no established church, although it has to be said we had a good many religious tests in certain of the colonies before the Constitution was written. England will have a Bill of Rights, so will we. That Bill of Rights will include what we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, including the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. The right to bear arms comes from the English Civil War and the ability of those who supported the Puritans to be armed and really support the Puritans and the Parliament. One other thing came across from these events in England. One other thing made it across the ocean as well. Thanks to these events, America got its second university, its second institution of higher learning. The first was Harvard, and it was part of the Puritan legacy. The second oldest university in America is named for the new sovereigns of England, William and Mary. William and Mary University in Williamsburg, Virginia. William was Mary's husband. Mary was the one with the close attachment to the throne, blood relationship to the king, but it's not going to be Mary and William University. In spite of that, it's William and Mary University. As I say, our second oldest institution of higher learning. If this, particularly what I had to say about Locke and Newton's similarities, made things worse or even didn't help, let me know by email, and we'll take care of it. So we're good for now.